Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, as time continues moving forward from the launch of Early Access for Path of Exile 2, players are working out more and better ways to gain in power, and with this, some extremely powerful and particularly cool-looking builds have come up too. Last week, we did a bit of a roundup of the best ones that I have seen so far for each ascendancy as of that point, both in power and just interesting build concepts as well. So today, let's do an update on the same thing, especially now that we are a few days past the patch that nerfed the hell out of trigger skills, which were very dominant in the top builds before. As usual for this kind of video as well, when talking about the builds, the original creator will be on screen. This is mostly a showcase of the potential for each ascendancy right now, so if you have more specific questions about each build, feel free to check out the original creator and ask the person who knows the build best. As well, it's worth mentioning before we start, there was a major patch last night, and for the most part this was full of buffs for a lot of the weaker skills, more so than nerfs to the top end of things. However, there is a slight exception to that, which is that specifically Vine Arrow has had its damage reduced at high levels, and chain freezing enemies as a concept has been made less effective. As for the builds on this list specifically, while it is still quite soon after the patch, none of them uses Vine Arrow as their main source of damage, and none of them rely on freezing the same enemy multiple times either, so these all should be just as strong as they were yesterday pretty much, and now there's the added bonus that they reduce the cost of refunding skill points, so if you want to try any of these and lean any of the playstyles yourself, it's much easier to do so. First up then, let's start again with the Warrior and the Titan Ascendancy. The coolest and strongest looking build I've seen so far for this is still heavily based around Hammer of the Gods, turned into fire damage and then applying ignites to extend its damage out and turn what would normally be a very short but potent burst of damage on a long cooldown into a much longer lasting potent burst of damage, strong enough to take out higher tier map bosses in a single button press. But over the past few days, a new tech was worked into it, as the build has just insane survivability already through ridiculous health regen and the incredible burst damage on a long cooldown from Hammer of the Gods, but consistent smaller enemy clearing wasn't really that effective. This has since been fixed by working in Stampede, a skill that charges forwards, pairing it with the Ascendancy node to make crushing blows apply heavy stun to primed targets, the Devastate support to fully break armor when applying heavy stun, and the Armor Explosion support to make enemies explode for a big chunk of damage when their armor is broken. Then you just use Stampede to just heavy stun and break armor on a pack of enemies, causing them to rattle off explosions into each other until they pop. Next up then, we have the Warbringer Ascendancy, whose best build that I've seen so far is still fully based around armor break, from the same build creator as well as it was the last time we talked about this, though it has seen some updates over the past few days. The most meaningful ones being once you actually reach the stats, you can run the Giant's Blood keystone, which lets you use two-handed weapons in one hand, at the cost of significantly increased stat requirements. Before this though, the main sort of active skill for your output is actually just the one-handed mace auto attack, which you put a bunch of armor breaking shenanigans into, but once you have Giant's Blood, you can upgrade to using Stampede for general clearing with a two-handed mace in one hand. As a combination with all of your passive choices as well, you can make this so it breaks all of your enemy's armor on use every single time, and due to the Warbringer Ascendancy node that lets you put enemies into literally negative armor from armor break, combine that with the Armor Explosion support gem, which makes enemies release an explosion when their armor gets fully broken, combined with Herald of Ash as well, which is a spirit aura releasing a puff of flames when an enemy dies and applying an ignite to anything nearby, where the damage scales with how hard you overkilled the enemy, as in how much you damage them past their actual health bar. This makes the build much more nuts for clearing, as the one use of Stampede breaks armor from down below negative to make the actual damage then increase massively, overkill that enemy by a massive amount, and then spread that damage around through Herald of Ash through everything, killing it ridiculously quickly. After that then, let's talk about the sorceress. First up with the Stormweaver Ascendancy. The best build that I've seen for this is still an Archmage focused build, but now focused heavily around Spark specifically. The idea of this is stacking loads of maximum mana and mana regeneration, fueling Archmage as an aura skill to make your lightning spells do a ton of bonus damage at the cost of much higher mana consumption. But then some people are mixing that with a unique belt that makes you recoup a portion of your damage taken as mana, others are instead using the gloves that make all lightning damage apply electrocution, deciding crowd control is the best method of survivability instead. But then you can all mix with this with the Mind Over Matter notable passive, which makes you take all damage from your mana pool before your life pool, and Chaos Inoculation to give you only one maximum life but make you completely immune to chaos damage, the only thing that is extra effective against energy shields. Then you just stack spell damage, work around shock as an ailment, and just build mana to the moon, which then further scales with your Ascendancy nodes, giving you Arcane Surge for increased cast speed and mana regen, but then also the Ascendancy node that increases the effect of Arcane Surge as a buff, scaling infinitely depending on your maximum mana, so it all just very naturally sort of synergizes together. You can work in Pure Power as a notable as well to scale lightning damage off of your intelligence nearly infinitely, and intelligence also affects your mana, so all this stuff just fits together together very nicely to destroy everything on the screen. Moving on, the other ascendancy for this class is Chronomancer, and the new strongest and most interesting build that I've seen breaching the deeper endgame for this is a Comet-based cold build, and one of the few times in Path of Exile 2 that I've seen someone personally cast Comet sort of manually rather than generating it through a trigger skill to be auto-cast. That said, essentially the idea behind this is a bunch of cold synergy. The main actual gameplay loop is using frost walls to keep enemies away from you and freeze things, then slow manually cast Comet while the wall is in the way of them getting to you. This will just one-shot enemies with the right gear because of the actual effect on it, the damage and the range that it hits, and the passive tree choices behind it as well. The actual damage of this is fairly high, and the way that this is turned into a more clear focused build is by adding extra comets on either side of the main one, and then also increasing the area of effect for all of them with the magnified effects support gem as well, then boosting the damage of this just a ton, including use of things like Frost Bomb to apply cold exposure, which reduces enemy cold resistance, Hypothermia, which lowers enemy cold resistance as well, and then the ascendancy specific spell Temporal Rift. This puts you backwards 4 seconds in time to the amount of life, mana, and energy shield you had at that moment. This lets you sort of spam comets out in the situations where it's necessary and then get your mana back like it's nothing. And otherwise, it mostly acts as an emergency button in case a Frostwall placement didn't work out, and you take a big chunk of your energy shield or life as damage. But for the most part, the bread and butter is just using Frostwall for managing the enemies, and then using Comet for deleting them once all the buffs are applied. After that, we have the Mercenary, starting with the Witchhunter Ascendancy being the more popular of the two, and this is still shaking out pretty much the same way it was a few days ago. The main synergy here is taking gas grenades, a skill that creates poison gas, and then detonating the gas for a bunch of bonus damage by causing an ignited enemy nearby. This can be done in a couple of different ways, either making it auto-ignite by using one of a couple of different uniques that exist within the game that can make you ignite anything that is near you, and when an enemy is ignited and gas is on the screen, the detonations will happen automatically. The slightly more complex version of this that frees up a gear slot instead gets rid of these uniques and uses an explosive grenade as the trigger for the detonations of the gas, and the main difference is you have a small duration to wait after shooting the grenades out before the explosion happens, rather than it all just sort of exploding in front of and surrounding you. Witchhunter especially has more things worked around this too, things like stun grenades with multiple projectiles to apply a load of stun, oil grenades which slow and apply fire exposure to enemies, reducing their fire resistance, or even things like Voltaic Grenade to apply not just shock for increased damage, but electrocute specifically with this skill, which then gives you big periods of free damage output where the enemy is just completely locked down. Not to mention things like just Witchhunter having the ability to knock things down to 70% of their health on the first hit if you get lucky, and the ability to just automatically cull things as well. It's just a very strong sort of general build and a very strong sort of setup to work around it. Then we have the Gemling Legionnaire Ascendancy aside from that, and put simply, this Ascendancy's best build is still pretty much just a variation on the best Witchhunter build as well. They both work most notably around gas grenades and detonating them through ignites or explosions, but where Witchhunters tend to prefer using auto-ignite uniques to sort of simplify the loadout, Gemling Legionnaire tends to be a bit more willing to pop these detonations manually, especially as they have a ton of other skills to work into the rotation within those fuse timers anyways, as one of the best Ascendancy nodes here lets you have more skill gems equipped, which you can use to either just stack up on auras, the persistent buff spirit skills, or you can use it to work in more utility or crowd control options for active use. But then the real sort of cherry on top Ascendancy node that separates this build from the Witchhunters, even though they do similar things, is the one that lets Gemling Legionnaire equip the same support gem on multiple different skills, instead of support gems being locked to one use per entire character. This simply lets you build a lot more silly shenanigans within your skills, and long-term late game changes up the way that the build both looks and feels quite significantly between the Ascendancies. Next up then is the Monk. First up, the Invoker Ascendancy was doing a ton of cast-on shenanigans, but since the nerf to trigger skills, this has changed up significantly. Instead, Invokers are taking advantage of their potential for extremely high maximum spirit by using a ton of persistent buff aura skills at the same time for both a lot of damage and survivability, but then also for power charge generation, and then using only a couple of abilities actively for your actual main damage, with the general best versions I've seen using Charged Staff for a general lightning damage buff, often having Tempest Flurry and Tempest Bell as a combo for higher burst damage moments, but then otherwise at a high end, once you have the gem sockets available, you can do things like either Flicker Strike or Falling Thunder very consistently to do very high damage to spend your power charges regularly while you generate them passively from either the Combat Frenzy and Resonance combo, or from some variation of a trigger skill activating a power charge generating ability. In general, these also stack a ton of both crit and attack speed for their build style as well, which is just very fun to play around, and then a ton of energy shield and evasion for survivability purposes. Not to mention that it synergizes quite well with the Invoker Ascendancy nodes that let your actual critical damage ignore elemental resistances on your enemies, and the ones that give you a ton of bonus spirit too. Following that, we have the Chayula Ascendancy, which so far doesn't really seem to have its own personality ability, so to say. Generally speaking, this ascendancy is very sort of open. It doesn't lean too far in one direction or another, but that also means that succeeding on it depends on your own creativity rather than the ascendancy itself pushing you towards building in specific synergistic ways. Aside from necessarily chaos damage, which it can boost, but the best build that I've seen so far for this ascendancy doesn't even use the chaos boosting nodes, instead focusing fully on buffing the flames of Chayula, the actual buffing objects you can walk into and pick up, the ability to make mana leech also affect your energy shield for a load of tankiness gain, but then also working that around the chaos inoculation passive, which sets your maximum life to 1 but makes you fully immune to chaos damage, which is the only thing specifically strong against energy shields to begin with. And then for the offense, this is mostly just building around crit, chaos damage, and poison as a concept. Specifically, most of the group clearing is done through a combination of Contagion, the occult skill, which is a chaos damage over time debuff that spreads when a target dies to other enemies, and then mixing that with the Rain of Arrows and the Envenom support to make it a big, meaty poison damage attack. The Herald of the Plague aura, which makes poisoned enemies spread their poison to nearby enemies as well, and then you work in Vine Arrow for crowd control that gets damage boosted if it is hit by a poison damage effect, and Freezing Salvo to apply a load of cold damage and freeze enemies as a result too. Then Toxic Growth just fires down a load of toxic pustules on the ground, which you can then apply poison to make them do a bunch of bonus damage when they explode, and that is your main sort of burst ability for this as well, for dealing with higher health rares or for bosses along the way too. Our next class then is the Ranger, beginning with the Deadeye Ascendancy, which is just doing some pretty incredible things with a relatively simple but very powerful setup. The specific one, of course, here being Lightning Arrow, Lightning Rod, and this is directly from the top ladder ranking Deadeye that exists at the moment, and the idea is essentially just using Lightning Rod with Scattershot and the Deadeye bonus projectile ascendancy node to fire out a load of lightning rods with each cast, then using Lightning Arrow to chain lightning between all of these and cause a chain reaction of explosions from each of the lightning rods you've placed, which do most of the damage to enemies from these. The build itself puts Cold Infusion on Lightning Arrow 2, lowering the damage of Lightning Arrow's lightning itself, but the main point of this is to give you freeze to trigger cast on freeze with mob clearing. This then lets you apply Voltaic Mark for free, making enemies easier to shock, and then activating cast on shock to create ball lightnings, which then fire out chain lightning to trigger the lightning rods and proc them even further. The result is, even in super high tier endgame content, most enemies die in a couple of blasts of arrows into a lightning rod setup, especially when working in Herald of Ice to make frozen enemies shatter and explode into things that are around them, and Herald of Thunder to gain bonus lightning bolt procs after killing shocked enemies. Then for bosses, you do some slight changes around, working in Orb of Storms for bonus chaining lightning, and then just firing in a ton of lightning rods to chain between and around the boss as well, with the note that the creator recommends the Thief's Torment unique ring for bossing if you can get it within the setup, as it's the only way to gain mana on hit, and without mana on hit, you can just empty your mana pool extremely quickly against a boss, spamming out the skills for this build. Moving on to the other ascendancy for the class then, that is the Pathfinder, and the best build that I've seen for this is just an extremely poison-based setup with some pretty fun synergy involved. This is mostly based around Gas Arrow as a skill, which is the poison damage more basic arrow that spreads gas around. Using the Corrosion support gem, this makes the poison damage from this break enemy armor on hit. Armor Explosion as a support gem as well will cause fiery explosions when an enemy's armor breaks, and the fire damage from this can ignite enemies, which counts as a detonator for the Gas Arrow's clouds too. Not to mention also adding in Fire Infusion as a support gem to this skill to boost the fire damage that it does and make these explosions more easy to trigger. Then there's also Toxic Growth, again like for the Hand of Chayula build. This is mostly just for stacking with your other poisons for larger bursts of damage against things like chunkier health rare enemies or bosses, and then for a similar purpose is Plague Bearer as an aura skill that stores up damage based on the poisons that you apply, and then can be released at will for a burst related to the damage stored. This also uses Combat Frenzy as an aura to generate Frenzy. Rain of Arrows is a frenzy spender that also applies a load of crowd control through supports like Withering Touch, Maim, and then also Pin, but then also Vine Arrow for more of a utility purpose to slow enemies and apply some more poison, and then Barrage is a buff to either Gas Arrows itself or to Rain of Arrows depending on the situation, adding a bunch of bonus shots to either of these. This build also of course leans into poisons, especially in the ascendancy nodes for the class, not only gaining the ability to make dying enemies spread their highest damage poison to others, and the ability to apply the double amount of poisons to enemies in general as well, which is extremely potent. Then our final class today is the Witch, starting with the Infernalist Ascendancy. The most ridiculous thing that I've seen coming out of this recently at least is just fully building around Skeletal Reavers specifically, and for the most part the setup that you can get around them is so strong that the original creator of this build could literally just run around and clear tier 16 maps without a single active skill on their bar, just letting the minions kill stuff while they run around and roll to avoid damage. This is honestly impressive as all hell. Obviously this can expand pretty easily outside of the gimmick of a 0-button build to make it much stronger. Skeletal Reavers active makes them enrage, which then makes them gain gain rage on hit, increasing their damage and attack speed with each stack, but then they also start to drain their own health per second. To counteract this, you then add skeletal cleric minions. With a few of these active, it will actually counteract the health drain from the enrage with the healing these do. Then you of course have your Infernal Hound as part of your ascendancy, and you just build it to be tanky as hell, as their entire reason to exist honestly is that they take a portion of the damage before you do, essentially acting as damage reduction for you as long as they are alive. Then you've got some other skills to support this too: raise zombie in case of AI issues with the minions in certain areas or for more protection, and then the same combo that Stormweavers are using a lot, which is the Mind Over Matter Keystone, which makes all damage come from your mana before your life, and then the Midnight Braid Belt, which makes 50% of all damage taken recoup as mana, and as a combo this is just essentially bonus 50% damage reduction on top of some other pretty useful bonuses too. Finally for today then is the Blood Mage Ascendancy, and a few days ago things were a bit grim for this, but as time has passed and things have been fixed with Leech, players have worked out more ways to make this actually feel really good to play, and pretty potent too, with the best way of doing so that I've seen so far being this crit-based physical damage build with Bone Cage as the main output for clearing, and applying crowd control using Spell Cascade as a support to create 3 Bone Cages instead of 1, Astral Projection to let you place it wherever you want instead of it being blocked on top of you, and then just cost reductions and converting the mana cost to life cost to make it more spammable for a Blood Mage. Then you've got Detonate Dead as your main burst for larger enemies while clearing through larger crowds, and Bone Storm as your main boss killing based ability, which is where you put in your more typical physical damage supports like Brutality, as well as Arcane Tempo to increase the cast speed, Splinter for Armor Break to increase your damage to the target with each hit, and Concentrated Effect to lower the radius of it but increase the damage, as is fitting for a boss killing focus skill within the build. Then you just run Grim Feast as an aura for energy shield bonuses and overflow, Blink for movement, and Life Remnants of course as part of the Blood Mage. Then you've just got by far the most competent endgame build that I've seen for this ascendancy as of this point. That just about does it for today then everyone, an updated list of the best and most interesting builds that I've seen for every ascendancy in the endgame of Path of Exile 2's early access so far. Either if you're just interested in seeing what your class choice can look like in deep endgame, or maybe you're just looking for inspiration of a way to take your character as you progress. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.